Good morning. We actually meant to scare you so that you know you're awake. Well, good morning, everyone. Distinguished laureates, of course, Your Excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all here today to the House of Sweden and the Embassy of Sweden on, I think, one of the most beautiful locations in the United States, I will even say. I think it's fantastic, and we are so happy to be here at the riverfront of the Potomac River. My name is Karin Olofsdotter, and I'm the Swedish ambassador to the United States. And it's great to see so many of you here today. We have made it into an annual tradition to welcome the American Laureates of the present year to House of Sweden to get a chance to learn about science from the best and the brightest there are. And they have promised actually to make it understandable. And this is also, of course, an opportunity for us who are not experts, as I said, to understand what they actually are talking about and why they won the prize, and how their research also affect us and our daily lives. The United States is, of course, somewhat of a champion when it comes to Nobel Prizes. Almost every year, a handful of the laureates are American or affiliated at American universities. This is, of course, a true testament to the outstanding research powerhouse that the United States is. So today, we have the great honor to welcome the following three to the House of Sweden. In medicine, Professor William G. Kaelin, Jr., and Professor Gregg L. Semenza. And in physics, Professor P. James E. Peebles. Actually, in 2019, there are 8 American laureates, and 3 of them are with us today. Oops. So congratulations to all of you and to your families, because I know many times families and friends are extremely important to you going forward and reaching the research levels where you have come at, because you really need their cheer, I guess, because it's not easy every day to do the research that you have done. We, of course, also want to recognize the other American laureates this year who unfortunately could not be here today. So in chemistry, it's Professor John B. Goodenough and Professor M. Stanley Whittingham. And in the economic sciences, it is Mr. Abhijit Banerjee, Mrs. Esther Duflo, and Mr. Michael Kramer. And this year, I also have the great honor to introduce our newly appointed Swedish Minister of Trade, Foreign Trade and Nordic Issues, Ms. Anna Hallberg. We are really delighted that you could join us here today and conclude your first visit in your new role. And of course, a warm welcome and welcome back to our moderator, Dr. Leshner, who has graced us by moderating this Nobel Symposium for I don't know how many years now? 10 years. Oh, so it's a jubilee. That's fantastic. In addition to your long list of merits at the AAAS, National Institute for Health, and the National Science Foundation, you can really add expert on the House of Sweden and the Nobel Prize, of course. I would like to highlight our major partners for this year. It's the Swedish Energy Agency, IKEA USA, Volvo Group, Axis Communications, ABB, Digiplex, Saab, Barbara Osher Pro Suecia Foundation, the Swedish Institute, the Swedish Arts Council, Volvo Cars, and Absolut Vodka. Yes, it's a great drink, I can assure you. And I hope you have had the time to test our barista robot downstairs. I hear that he or she, it's hard to detect if it's a he or a she, makes an excellent latte, so please do that. And we are also live streaming today, so if you are watching at home and you want to join the dialogue, please do so on Twitter using the hashtags Nobel Prize, hashtag Sweden Nobel USA, and our handle, that is Sweden in USA. So today we bring our laureates into the spotlight and let them inspire us and others around the world. So, of course, knowledge and science have a big role in uniting people, and it's important to acknowledge that these processes benefit from sharing ideas across borders and nations, of course, as well. So we certainly look forward to the symposium and hearing from you today. First, I would just like to hand over the floor to Minister of Trade, Hallberg. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Karin, for the introduction. I couldn't pick a better day to visit Washington and the House of Sweden. And I must say, this is it's a fantastic opportunity for me to be here, to meet you all, and also to listen to this symposium. I do look forward to it a lot. The building and the location itself, of course, they are worth mentioning. It's fantastic, but this great event today, with such a distinguished group of American scholars present, is wonderful to be part of for me. First of all, congratulations. Nobel, and what the Nobel Prize stands for, is a pride for us in Sweden. In 1895, Swedish innovator Alfred Nobel signed his last testament, giving the largest share of his fortune to a series of prizes in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace, the Nobel Prizes. In 1968, the Swedish central bank established also the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Science in memory of Nobel's legacy. Your contributions to this legacy and to your respective fields are the reason why we are here today. Your scientific efforts, your endurance in endless processes of trial and error, and your commitment to making new discoveries will be substantial when facing challenges to come. Both Sweden and the US have built our prosperity on the contributions of science and innovation. Our universities learn from each other, our industries collaborate, and the broad exchange between our respective countries help us to channel our joint expertise and for the realization of common goals. We are regarded as two of the most innovative and creative countries in the world, and those of you present here today are truly a testimony to that. The Swedish strategy for sustaining our competitive edge within science and innovation is based on embracing new technologies, adopting our industry for future demands, and contributing with large investments in R&D in order to make Sweden an attractive location to work and study in. This has proven to be a successful approach in the case of medtech and life science, in information and communications technology, in automotive manufacturing and green technology, where Swedish research and companies excel. But most importantly, making sure our citizens can pursue their scientific efforts and ideas without risk of losing economic support and remaining adjustable to transformations associated with globalization. Alfred Nobel understood the importance of these factors. At the time of his death, Nobel held 355 patents in different countries. There were Nobel companies in more than 20 countries, and he himself lived and worked in Sweden, Russia, France, the UK, Germany, and Italy. The 10th of December, the day of the Nobel Prize award ceremony, is almost a national day in Sweden. And many Swedes follow the celebration on live TV. We really look forward to hosting you in Stockholm in December and to celebrate all your achievements. Congratulations again, and thank you very much.
Good crowd. Well, good morning, everyone. Okay, that's not acceptable. This is a fabulous event. We're all ecstatic, A, to be here, B, to have them here. Therefore, if you don't mind, can we do that again? Yeah. Good morning. Thank you very much. I, by the way, am still Alan Leshner. So I love doing this. This is one of my favorite things ever. And as the ambassador said, I've done it before. And before we start, I would like to just remind you of the ground rules. First of all, they're going to talk first. Then you'll get an opportunity to ask some questions. And I've been told that you have to wait for a microphone, otherwise people won't hear it, and it's being live streamed. And I just want to remind you what the definition of a question is. A question, you know, your voice goes up at the end. It does not have a preamble. And you ask briefly, they answer, and then you sit down. Okay, got it? Thank you. So while you're planning your questions, the other thing is there's a rule I like that surrounds being in this room. This is the best room for an event like this in Washington. You may all now look to your right, enjoy the view, and don't do it again. Thank you. Danger in this room is that it's highly distracting, but it's really terrific. So the way we like to do this is actually practice for them for their Swedish debut in Sweden. And we'd like to ask them first to go in order and just give us a sense of what they did and its import, sort of why we care about it. And after we do that, we'll open it up to the floor. So we're going to start with Dr. James Peebles from Princeton University. You can sit if you'd like. Which would you prefer?
I'd like to stand.
You may stand.
Thank you. My knees get stiff. So the first thing to understand about my field is that its name, Big Bang Theory, is quite inappropriate. It connotes the notion of an event and a position, both of which are quite wrong. What I've been awarded for is advances in the study of the evolution of a universe that is close to uniform, expanding and cooling. It's quite dramatic when you stop to think about it that we're saying that this universe of ours is not forever. It is evolving. We have a distant past that was quite different and a future that is quite unknown. Just briefly, we have compelling evidence that our universe has evolved from a hot state according to the rules of Einstein's general theory of relativity, because the evolution left fossils. Most prominently, of course, the sea of thermal radiation that fills space-time near uniformly, that surely could not have been produced in the universe it is now. It requires that the universe was dense and hot enough to have relaxed to statistical equilibrium. Other features that are in the fossil record include the small irregularities in the distribution of the radiation, the large irregularities in the distributions of the galaxies. It all hangs together wonderfully well. But now I'd like to pause and reflect on the fact that I've spent, 60 years in this field. It is a subject that will never be monetized. And we might ask ourselves, why should the university devote precious resources to this, and why should you care? The answer, I think, is that we are born with a strong imperative to understand what's going on. I have developed a theory, which I have not discussed with anyone, one person. You look into the eyes of a young baby. You make eye contact. I decided that that's a haunting experience because I'm confident that baby is wondering, what is going on? And it is that desire to understand what's going on that drives us to look at molecular biology all the way down to quarks, that drives us to look out into space to see that there are other planets around galaxies, that their galaxies are moving apart and that our universe is evolving. That will never pay off in anything except the satisfaction in this drive to understand what's going on. Thank you.
That was great. I suspect your family may be disappointed that it won't be monetized, but I agree with you. Thank you. We did not publish that last theory in Science, by the way. Let me turn to Dr. Gregg Semenza from Johns Hopkins. You're welcome to sit or stand as you choose.
Okay, I'll get him.
Oh, don't do that.
Or not. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like just to start by having everyone take a deep breath and hold it. Alan, check to see that everyone's holding it, please. Thank you. So we've studied responses to low oxygen because oxygen is really critical for every one of the 100 trillion cells in your body. Okay, you can breathe now. So I think I've impressed on you the fact that oxygen is the thing that you can do without for the least period of time. And because it's critical for every cell in your body to make energy. And if your body could not make that energy, you could not have 100 trillion cells working together. And what we've studied is a mechanism that allows every cell to sense the oxygen concentration, and if there's not enough oxygen being delivered to that cell, it does two things. It turns on mechanisms to increase oxygen delivery to the cell, and it turns on mechanisms so that the cell can survive with less oxygen. So it needs less oxygen to survive. And these things are all occurring at the level of gene expression. And what we identified is sort of a master regulator that in every cell of the body, when oxygen is sensed, it sends a signal. We're not getting enough oxygen, do something. And then in every cell of the body, thousands of genes are expressed at higher levels. Thousands of genes are expressed at lower levels. And this all occurs within a matter of minutes and hours. So this system is very critical, both for the development of all of the organs that we need to get oxygen, the circulatory system and the respiratory system, then for the utilization of those systems to maintain oxygen levels, to maintain a balance between supply and demand, okay, and to deliver oxygen to every one of those 100 trillion cells. So this is a really logistical nightmare if you think about it. It's like FedEx having to deliver 100 trillion packages every minute, and where those packages are going may be changing over time. And this is also very critical in terms of the common diseases that affect us in industrialized societies. So in ischemic cardiovascular disease, there's narrowing of blood vessels in the heart, for example, that reduce the delivery of oxygen. And those cells have to signal a response. But unfortunately, with aging, this beautiful system kind of becomes slowed down. And the response does not occur at the at the level that it should in under conditions of, let's say, a youthful heart. And so we're trying to understand what are the mechanisms that prevent the response from occurring, and how can we supplement the response therapeutically. Then in cancer, you have cells that are growing out of control. And of course, the more cells there are, the more oxygen is being consumed. And cells actually grow so far away from a blood vessel, which is the source of oxygen, that they may die because they don't get enough oxygen. And you say, well, what's the matter with that? A dead cancer cell, that's a good thing. But the problem is that there are cells slightly closer to blood vessels that are not getting very much oxygen, but those cells survive. And those cells, it turns out, can survive pretty much anything that oncologists can throw at them. And we believe it's those cells that survive and come back and eventually cause the death of patients who die of cancer. And what we're working toward is developing drugs that will target those cells that can be combined with the drugs that target the rapidly dividing cells that are near sources of oxygen. And that combination may be more effective for treating breast cancer, many other solid cancers. And really, that's our goal, is to try to take what we've learned in the lab and to develop new therapies as a result of that. Thank you very much.
Great. That was great. Now we're going to find out if you think he's right. Next is Dr. William Kaelin, who's from Dana-Farber Cancer Center, Harvard Medical School, Howard Hughes, Brigham and Women's.
Yeah, Brigham and
Yeah, I wanted to get them all.
Thank you. Well, my job's been made a little bit easier because Gregg has nicely introduced my topic, which is oxygen sensing. But as often happens in science, we came at this from a very different angle. And then our line of investigation sort of collided with Gregg's and Peter's circa the year 2000. So we were studying rare individuals. It's about 1 in 35,000 people worldwide who have an abnormal version of the so-called VHL gene. And a gene is simply a segment of DNA that contains the instructions for making a protein. So scientists sometimes get a little sloppy using gene and protein interchangeably, but the gene is the instructions for making the protein. Yeah. But what drew us to this was that these people with a defective VHL gene are at very high risk of developing certain cancers. And I should point out that frequently this abnormal gene has been passed from generation to generation in these families. So they have seen their parents and their grandparents succumb to cancer at a very early age. So they sort of have the sword of Damocles over their neck. And what attracted us to this problem was that the tumors that these individuals were developing were notorious for producing the various distress signals that normal tissues produce when they're not getting enough oxygen. So this was the clue that the VHL gene, or if you will, the VHL protein, was a critical part of how cells normally sensed oxygen, because it was clear when the VHL gene was defective, this system was broken, and now the tumors were constantly producing these various distress signals that, again, should normally only be produced if cells are not getting enough oxygen. And so eventually, we were able to show that the VHL protein's main job is to regulate that HIF protein, this master regulator that Gregg alluded to, that normally serves to turn on these various genes that direct these various distress signals to be produced. So now this was sort of the yin and the yang. We could understand that if you don't have the VHL protein, the HIF protein becomes overactive and starts telling the cell to produce these various distress signals that would normally be produced by would normally only be activated when cells weren't getting enough oxygen. And eventually our group and Peter Ratcliffe's group showed independently that what happens is, in the presence of oxygen, a very unusual chemical flag gets added to HIF, and that serves as the signal for the VHL protein to bind. So with that and other pieces of the puzzle, we had a fairly complete picture of how cells and tissues respond to changes in oxygen and adapt to changes in oxygen. And once we had the circuit in hand, there were several places where we could intervene pharmacologically. So for example, in diseases that are characterized or caused by inadequate oxygen delivery, like anemia, heart attack, stroke, we now have new drugs that will mimic this hypoxic response and activate the HIF protein and help the cells and tissues survive in a low oxygen environment. Conversely, as Gregg alluded to, certain cancers sort of co-opt or hijack the system so they can now get, for example, a blood supply. And now we have new drugs that will inactivate HIF so the cancers can't use it. So we can basically play both sides of the street. So that's basically what we did. I will tell you, I liked Sweden before. I like Sweden even more now. And depending on the events of 2020, I may be looking for the door that's marked asylum seekers, and I will. So maybe we can talk. Maybe we can talk later. Okay. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, we're going to open it up to the floor. Who wants to have at 'em first? Really? They're that clear. That's good. While you're incubating, I have a question. So often, people who receive Nobel Prizes for doing things that when they first were thought about were considered to be heretical. So hark back, when you first started working on the issue, the problem that eventually led to the prize, was it part of sort of incremental science where science progresses by just systematic small steps, or was there something transformative that popped into your head and that in fact led to the work? Just go ahead.
I'll give it a try. So I don't think it's an accident that this year's Nobel Prize in Medicine is shared by 3 individuals who are all physician scientists. And you may or may not know that physician scientists are somewhat of an endangered species. A lot of physicians find it's too hard to give up all of their clinical training and, frankly, potential future income to actually learn the skills required to do laboratory-based investigation. But I would say time after time, physician scientists have often played roles in important discoveries of medical relevance. And all scientists are puzzle solvers. I think we were all interested in oxygen sensing as a puzzle, but I think as physician scientists, we also knew that many diseases are linked to abnormalities in oxygen. So I think in the back of my mind, and I suspect your mind too, Gregg, was the idea that if we understood this, this would have immediate applications. And that's in contrast, of course, to a lot of other beautiful science where you don't know for decades or maybe forever whether it's going to be practical. The last thing I would say is when we actually understood the chemical signal, what we couldn't predict and certainly couldn't control was whether that signal was going to strike anybody as being novel and elegant. We had no control over that, but I think once we had that signal before us and could see how interesting and elegant and beautiful it was, at least in my mind, I thought, maybe this will lead to Stockholm one day, but of course I had no control over that.
Right?
So in my lab, we started asking a very, very specific question. We were studying the gene that controls the production of erythropoietin, or EPO. You've probably heard of it because, for example, cyclists in the Tour de France were using it because the more red blood cells you have, the better you can perform in endurance events. And we were trying to understand how is it that this gene can get turned on if there's not enough oxygen. And this gene is expressed in the kidney. So we started with a very specific question involving just one gene. That led us to, we first found the control region in the EPO gene that allowed this to occur. And we showed that we could take that out of the EPO gene and put it into any other gene, and now that gene would respond to hypoxia, to low oxygen. Then we thought that there would be a protein that bound to that control sequence, and we wanted to identify it, and we were able to do that, and we called that hypoxia-inducible factor 1. Factor just means it's a protein. Induced means it's turned on by, and hypoxia means low oxygen. So this is HIF1. And we identified the protein, showed it was required to turn on the EPO gene, and that the protein was accumulated in cells that were being deprived of oxygen. Then we did an experiment in which we asked, is HIF1 turned on in cells that don't make EPO? And the answer was yes. And every cell that we looked at, HIF1 was turned on in response to low oxygen. And that immediately told us that HIF1 was playing a much broader role in the control of responses to changes in oxygen than just turning on the EPO gene. And so today we know of over 4,000 genes in the human genome that are turned on in different cell types in response to low oxygen in exactly the same way. HIF1 gets turned on, it binds to these control elements present in that particular gene, and that turns the gene on. So we started with something that was very limited, and then followed that into something that became very kind of all-encompassing. And the more we learn, the more different disease processes, developmental processes, even evolutionary processes that we find that this pathway is playing a critical role.
Great. Dr. Peebles.
So, to be emphasized is that we all, and all of natural scientists, are working toward one goal: try to understand what's going on. Each of us in a line of research will make progress in different ways because the operating conditions can be wildly different. You people are working on the deepest part of complexity. We have a term for that in fundamental physics. Giving it a name doesn't mean we understand it, but the simple notion of describing turbulence, what happens as you run down the street, you have a turbulent flow behind you. Understanding that is simple problem to state and almost infinitely complicated to deal with. It's complexity. The buzzword we would use is the system has forgotten its initial conditions. You guys, to dig down to initial conditions would be just, it's never going to happen. On the other hand, the universe, we're very lucky to find, operates in a simple way that can be analyzed without complexity, which is to say it's computable, which is to say we can devise tests, and we are fortunate that technology has allowed us to apply the tests with enough detail to give us a convincing story of what was happening. I hope there is a lesson to be drawn from simplicity into how dealing with complexity. You, of course, have the great experience. You've dealt with complexity through your entire careers without referring to fundamental physics.
Sorry.
And lived.
I like to think of chemists as operating on the boundary. They can actually compute binding energies of molecular hydrogen, even the benzene ring. A great triumph. But from there to where you were going, and I have asked, and you know, in fundamental physics we have quantum mechanics deep in the core, which we know is incomplete because it doesn't take account of gravity. That means that it's not it is not the final theory. You people are digging in another trench, down, 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 the chemists leading you to another trench. Chemists use something called density functional theory to attempt to understand molecules. It is a cousin of quantum mechanics, but no one has ever claimed that they're the same theory. We have then the beautiful theory of quantum mechanics, we have density functional theory, and we have you guys, all aiming toward a common basis. I've lost faith in the thought that that common basis will be quantum mechanics because we know it's wrong. You know, the statement, quantum mechanics is wrong, should be understood to mean that it's not totally right. It is wonderfully accurate, wonderfully successful. But I wonder if the theory that is at the heart of everything will not drift away from quantum mechanics and away from density functional theory and something way down in between. In short, we are not running out of spectacularly interesting things to do, even in simple physics.
You know, you keep saying simple physics. So I'm actually a neuroscientist, and you know, we worry about things like how does the mush in your head make a consciousness or little things like that. Yeah. But physics is totally impenetrable to me. So let me ask you to expand something. You've said this twice today, once when we were in the room there, and then you said it again here, about the Big Bang not really being a Big Bang. Say something about the time course, because most of us have this, I'll speak for myself, most of I have this image of sort of an explosion occurring, a rapid explosion. Suddenly, out of nothing was something, or out of X was something. So what do you mean when you say it's not a Big Bang? What's the time course? What's happening? Briefly.
It's a very unfortunate thought you expressed.
Sorry. Do I have to leave?
First out of nothing is not, that's not part of the game.
I know. It's out
Instead,
of unknown.
Instead, the game is to discover as much as we can about the evolution of the universe. We love to ask the question, how in the hell did it all begin?
I was going to ask you that.
And we don't know. It's important to understand to begin with, as I've already said, that none of our physical theories is complete. They're all approximations. Some of them are really good approximations, but none of them is final theory. And that means that you can ask questions of me on a theory in which I believe there is great evidence in support of it, and I can't answer. In particular, you know, our universe, the evidence is only about 5 or 6% the stuff you and I are made of. The rest of it, hypothetical, made up to fit the observations. But then that made up stuff, dark matter, dark energy, fits the experimental evidence so well that it's pretty clear. There will be a better theory of the evolution of the universe, but it'll predict a universe that looks a lot like the theory that we have now predicts the universe, because the universe observed in many ways looks the way our theory looks. I went off on that tangent because I wanted to stress that the theory I've been working on for 60 years is about evolution from an early state to a late state. You can ask, what happened before that early state? And of course people do, and they have lots of ideas, but they haven't been tested. And so that's out in left field.
Okay. How long did it take, the first thing
Well,
that we know about?
the earliest fossil of the hot Big Bang that we know is helium and deuterium, the light elements, formed when the universe was expanding from a temperature that is some 10 orders of magnitude greater than now, in a time scale measured, expansion time measured in seconds rather than tens of thousands of millions of years. It's quite a spread. Well argued because of lots of evidence of checks. What more can we say?
No, I like that. That actually helps. Okay. Please, say who you are.
I'm Tony Altar, and I have a question for...
Where do you come from?
come from a company called Verge Genomics in San Francisco.
Okay.
And I'm asking for...
Hold that closer.
Dr. Kaelin and Dr. Semenza, but also I think a cosmological interpretation of my question might also be of interest. The brain occupies 10 times more metabolism than other cells in the body. So my question for you would be, does HIF-1 alpha or this process of oxygen sensing, is it any what different in brain neurons? And is there a suggestion there for potential pharmacological intervention for diseases like ischemia, Alzheimer's, where we know that oxygen deprivation is really, metabolic deficiencies are really quite so prevalent?
Do you want to start with that?
Sure. One of the major techniques for studying brain activity is called a functional MRI, and that's based on the uptake of glucose by brain cells. So brain cells that are working hard take up more glucose than brain cells that are not working so hard. And this is so important that it can be used to actually look at where the brain is, what part of the brain is particularly active in response to any particular task or cue. So we know that this is very important. We know that HIF-1 controls, as I told you, the use of oxygen. So when oxygen is available, cells can take glucose and break it down in the mitochondria to just carbon dioxide and water. And that generates tremendous amounts of oxygen. But when oxygen is not available, then what the cells do is they switch from metabolizing it with oxygen to metabolizing it without oxygen, and then all they can do is break down the glucose into two parts. And that generates much less energy. But the point is that the cells have to make this switch if there's not enough oxygen okay? And of course, this is sort of a temporary measure until oxygen supply is improved. And we think about the responses that are controlled by HIF1, because there are changes in gene expression. They take a while because you have to turn the DNA into RNA, the RNA into protein. The protein has to accumulate. So this can often take hours. But there are other mechanisms that occur much more rapidly and probably on a moment-to-moment basis are important and critical. But when we think of, for example, chronic disease, so for example, in Alzheimer's disease, there's been, what's been noted is some changes in the blood vessels in the brain. And those changes may affect oxygen delivery, they may affect metabolism in the brain. And again, these things occur over many years, right? Chronic diseases over many years. And as I mentioned, in adults with aging, there tends to be an impaired response to these stimuli. So the short answer to your question is we don't know, but it's very likely to play an important role, particularly in neurodegenerative conditions. Bill?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think that's right. We're still learning the different ways that HIF can be involved in various diseases. I don't think we're smart enough to know yet how modulating HIF would affect various neurodegenerative diseases, although there's suspicion that in time that might be a fruitful avenue.
Can I just ask a fast follow? I apologize. I'm having a good time. I don't know about the rest of you. So how selective is the treatment approach that you're thinking of? That is to say, are these HIP deficiencies or excesses in very specific cells that can be targeted, or do you blast the whole body? And
yeah, so for example, there are now drugs that are just starting to be approved that do activate the HIF program or HIF protein in every cell in your body. But as you well know, most drugs are useful because you can adjust the dose to get a desired outcome. So it turns out that by taking these pills, you can trick the body into thinking it's at high altitude. And when you're at high altitude, one of the things you start to do is you make more red blood cells. And so this is turning out to be a new treatment for anemia. And at least in the laboratory, these drugs are very useful, even though given systemically for diseases where there's a regional problem in oxygen delivery, such as a heart attack and a stroke.
And just to expand on that, people who have chronic kidney disease stop making EPO because EPO is made in the kidneys. These new drugs can stimulate EPO production, but it doesn't appear that they're stimulating it in the kidney, but rather in the liver, where the EPO is made in fetal life.
Yeah.
So it's a great benefit that the drug is available to all the cells, because we wouldn't necessarily have thought that such a response was likely.
Right.
And that seems to be a major mechanism that will allow, so now people with renal failure have to have injections of this recombinant human EPO that's made in cells in large amounts. And now they'll just be able to take a pill, because these are small molecule that induce the HIF activity. And so this will, I think, be a real improvement for the quality of life of people with renal failure. You know, it's funny, people with renal failure used to tell the doctors, I feel lousy. And the doctor would say, oh, of course you feel lousy, you have renal failure. Yeah. And it was not because they had renal failure, it was because they had anemia. And when the anemia was treated, the patients felt much better. Yeah. So this is a situation where you're not changing the underlying disease, but you have an opportunity to improve the quality of life for people who are living with that disease. Yeah. And as Bill mentioned, these drugs, one of these drugs has been approved in China and Japan, and will probably be approved in the US if all goes well within the next year or so.
Wow. Terrific. Okay, who's next? Go ahead.
Yeah,
Say who you
I would
are.
like to go back to basic.
Who are
I'm
you?
thinking about the test. Okay. I'm Gunnel Hamilton. I'm a Swedish teacher. I was a language teacher in Sweden. and I have been living in America for 18 years.
Great. Speak loud.
Yeah. I'm going back to the basics here. I'm thinking about when I go to the doctor's office to do some tests, and they have this strange test when they put a thing on one of your fingers to check the oxygen in your blood.
Yes.
That is amazing. I don't know how they do it. But I also want to know if they should find some deficit in the blood, what can be done about it, and what kind of diseases is especially affected by the deficit of oxygen.
Very
Thank
good
you.
question.
So first of all, I think in many cases, measuring the oxygen in that way is probably confirmatory of the doctor's suspicion that maybe there's a problem, because you might have other symptoms associated with low oxygen. But I think numerically the most common causes of low oxygen delivery, again measured in your case, measuring oxygen in your blood, would be chronic heart disease or chronic lung disease, or there are very rare cases where people have some blood disorder that's affecting the ability of the blood to carry oxygen. But I think in most cases it should not come as a complete surprise saying, oh my God, you have low oxygen in your blood. You probably would have some symptoms and associated signs to go with that.
But again, it's a fundamental thing. If that value is low, something's wrong. Okay, something that needs to be pursued, and it's a very easy screening process to do, and that's why many physicians will do it, because the oxygen levels are so critical. And when we started our work, we were doing a lot of molecular biology, and the molecular biologists really didn't have a clue about the significance of hypoxia. But our clinical colleagues immediately understood the significance of working out the response to low oxygen, because it plays such a critical role in so many different human diseases.
Dr.
But
Peebles?
may I ask, there's a lot of oxygen in this room, thank goodness. I clamp onto my finger. How does it distinguish the oxygen in the room from the oxygen that might be diffusing out of my finger through the skin?
So it's actually based on the hemoglobin in the red cells.
Oh, I see.
Okay.
I see. It's measuring their color, or
See, we might not be physicists, but at least we got that, we got that part right.
Well,
Make a finger
congratulate you.
test work. I like it. That's good. Who's next? They're in charge, the people with the microphones.
Hi, I'm Ivan Amato, visiting researcher at AAAS, and
Good boy.
I'm working on a publishing project called the Moonshot Catalog. This is actually a question about your scientific imaginations and how they work. So from all of you, I heard kind of nested narratives. So I heard molecular narratives, cellular narratives, physiological narratives, narratives of health and illness, and clinical narratives from you, Dr. Peebles, that go all the way from quantum mechanics to the universe. So the question is, how do your scientific imaginations kind of use all of those, that sort of hierarchical level of narratives when you ask questions, when you go into the lab, when you, do they help you ask the questions and decide what kind of experiments to use?
I can start. So Bill mentioned that he and I are physician scientists. And for me, being trained both in basic research and clinical medicine, my goal has always been to connect the dots, to go from the basic molecular fundamental findings to applications in clinical medicine. And it's really the ability to connect those dots that has been most satisfying for me during this whole process, because we've gone from the very fundamental question, how does a cell sense the oxygen availability and respond to changes, all the way to can we generate new drugs for cancer and anemia. And that's really what's been most exciting for me, is to be able to follow the path from one scale to the next, if you will.
You wanted to say?
well, I wonder if you are influenced by visions. by pictures, by images in your mind of what's going on? Or is that too loose a description of what you do?
You know, I think often once we got started, you saw the data, you might need some imagination to decide what the data actually meant, but I was surprised how often the next question in the next experiment was semi-obvious once you got going. And again, maybe part of that's because as a clinical doctor, you're bombarded with data and then you have to start to make decisions and paint a picture. And so I found that part pretty easy. But I'm going to cheat a little bit and answer a related question or make an editorial comment, which is I've heard a number of scientists express concern that the way we educate young people today, we run the risk of sort of beating the curiosity and the imagination out of them because so much of their time is structured. And I remember growing up, I had a fair amount of time that was unstructured. Now, admittedly, some of it was probably wasted. I'm not sure Gilligan's Island helped me all that much. But I also had time where I was just told to go out in the yard and go amuse yourself and make up games. And, and I had toys that sort of stimulated your imagination, like chemistry sets with like real chemicals and things like that. So I think now you go from the classroom to the violin lesson to the soccer field to the Kumar math. I think we run the risk of sort of beating the curiosity out of people. So I think we have to maybe think about whether we have the balance right. And I know when I just got back from Asia, there's a lot of recognition that maybe there's so much rote memorization that by the time the kids are finally equipped to do science, they're completely exhausted and have no imagination left. So I think this is at least a dialogue that we should have.
That's a great...
I would just add briefly that it always seemed to me ironic that in physics, we teach our undergraduates how to address problems that are solvable. It is a difficult transition to investigating problems that have not been solved.
That's great. Actually, that's a very important point for the future of science. Okay, who's next? Please.
Sorry.
I got him.
Okay, my name is Ellen Devine. I'm from the Swedish Research Council, and my question is to Mr. Peebles. I read recently in the news, there's a new article came out. I think it was in Nature Astronomics or something like that.
I'm sorry. I publish science.
I'm a molecular biologist, I'm not a physics. But I think, if I understood it right, the new theory is not it's a new theory, it's just a suggestion that cosmos is not flat, but curved. I don't know if you heard about this.
Well,
it came out quite recently.
I have not, but...
My question is just that if this is true, of course it needs more studies, but if it's true that the universe is not flat, but it's curved, how will that affect our ideas of the evolution of cosmos? And is there any way you could explain that for someone like me who's just not in physics?
Right. So first, again, I stress that we have a theory that is an approximation to reality. We think it's a pretty good approximation. We know it's not exact. We hope to find anomalies that will point us in directions that will allow us to make a better theory. So indications such as that, as curved space sections, which are not allowed under some scenarios about what happened before the universe was as we know it, anomalies of that sort are deeply valued because they might be pointing to us to something new. I had not heard about the notion of curved space sections, but I can see that it must be related to the problem of establishing the distance scale. How far away are galaxies? We have different ways of measuring it, and they give inconsistent answers. Is that a problem with the difficulty of the measurement, or is it saying we're basing these measurements on a theory that is slightly off? And wouldn't it be wonderful if it was the latter?
Good. Okay, please.
Hi. I have two questions.
Who are
the
you?
first one is basically...
I have one. Who are you?
Belkis Mones. I am originally from Dominican Republic, but I consider myself a global citizen at this time. I would like to know your thoughts about what are the challenges we are going to face as humans in terms of oxygen adaptability, but as well in your area, with the transition we are living due to the changes in the ecosystem or the climate change. And the other one is in your research on adaptation to oxygen availability, have you analyzed what happens with the people that live normally with very low level of white blood cells?
White blood cells?
Yes, less than 2.5 million.
Okay, but be careful you don't prescribe.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
So this is really a part of the amazing story of life on Earth, because when life on Earth started, there was no oxygen. And it took about 1 billion years, but somehow a microorganism figured out a way to capture the sun's rays, the energy within the sun's rays, and use that to build carbon bonds to make glucose. And it did that using the sun's rays, water, and CO2. Okay? And that generated glucose, and as a side product, oxygen. And this oxygen did not accumulate initially because there's all this iron on the Earth that had to be oxidized. And that took a very long time to oxidize all of the iron on Earth. Then the other part of this, of course, though, is the glucose can then be broken down to release the energy. Okay? And that's the process that requires oxygen. So you have this beautiful circle of life in which the sun's rays allow CO2 and water to be joined into glucose and oxygen, and then the glucose and oxygen can be used to generate energy within cells. And you can see that that would be an equilibrium condition, right? If the two reactions are occurring at the same rate, you would not get any increased oxygen. So how did the oxygen increase? It increased because all of this organic matter was buried. And that glucose could not be broken down. And that meant that the oxygen was remaining, but the glucose was not broken down. And that buried matter became fossil fuels. Now those fossil fuels are being burned in excess, and of course the big effect is not the reduction in oxygen, but rather the increase in carbon dioxide. And this is the most fundamental challenge for us and for the next generation to whom we're going to leave this horrible mess, is how to address this problem, because it threatens life on Earth.
And we should notice that we don't really know what the direction of the effect of the added CO2 and methane will have on planet Earth. We could be heading toward another snowball Earth. We just don't know. It's complexity, not at the level you guys deal with, but the atmosphere is really complicated. And climate, well, we're doing a very dangerous experiment.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't think our work directly addresses white blood cells, or not nearly as well as it addresses red blood cells, but I echo the comments about climate change. I wrote a piece a couple years ago called Climate Change, What Would Lincoln Do? Because you may not know that Abraham Lincoln created the National Academy of Sciences precisely to be able to give apolitical, data-driven advice to policymakers. So Lincoln actually anticipated the need for a body like this. Sadly, that body's advice is being ignored. But I wrote in this piece several reasons why, even as a person who's not a climate scientist, you could see why so many of the denier arguments are ridiculous on their face. Because even if you are not a climate scientist, but you know something about science and the scientific method, you know, first of all, getting scientists to even agree on things that are objectifiably true is impossible, right? So we're like herding cats. So the idea that there's this grand conspiracy that all the scientists in the world know this is not true, but we're doing this to redistribute wealth is just beyond the imagination. So anyway.
All right. I do want to recognize that the president of the National Academy of Sciences is with us today, Dr. McNutt.
Did I give a plug? Did I get it right? Did I get it right? Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Okay. In the back, please.
It's my great pleasure to be listening report.
Can you speak louder, please, and into the
My
mic?
question about vascular system and hypoxia. My name is Lee. I came from University of Maryland. And in fact, my question is about kind of a animal, cave animal, because our lab uses a cave fish, a kind of fish live in the cave. So because the total dark and hypoxia, and this kind of fish, they are total lost eye. In fact, all the cave animals, if they live in the caves, almost they all lost eye. But the interesting thing is that during their development, during the early stage, they have the eye. But suddenly, before they hatching, some specific stages, their eyes suddenly degenerate. So we want to know why. And recently, our lab provided a new model about cave animal, why they are lost eye. Because we do find they have the vascular system problem. Because proper they cause a hypoxia. So they cause hypoxia, and finally we do find HIF gene is increased in the cavefish eye. So our question is, we know the vascular system have problem cause hypoxia. If the hypoxia will cause the vascular system have problem, because cave is an environment, they have low oxygen. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good luck.
Yes. So there are a number of species that have really remarkable adaptations where they can live under very low oxygen conditions. In addition to some of the fish species, there are these blind mole rats that live in caves, terrestrial caves, where there's very low oxygen, very high CO2. And these animals are remarkable because they can withstand being put into an environment of no oxygen for like 30 minutes, which obviously we can't survive more than a few minutes under those conditions. So the adaptation is really remarkable. And even within humans, we have humans who live at high altitude, for example, on the Tibetan plateau, where they've lived for tens of thousands of years at 30 or 3,000 meters or more. And the Tibetans have evolved adaptations to allow them to live really under normal physiological conditions as we have. And because of now of our ability to sequence the DNA, we've been able to identify changes in the genes in Tibetans that are not seen anywhere else, any other population. And the major changes that have been selected for in Tibetans are changes in the HIF pathway. So that's why I alluded to the fact that we can follow this through evolution and even see evidence of human evolution. And it's not just humans, because there are also animals who live in Tibet, and there are dogs, and their genomes have been sequenced, and guess what? They have changes in the same genes as
cool.
the humans. Yeah.
I like that. Okay, we have time for two quick ones, I've been told by my handler. Please.
Yes, Michael Atkins, medical oncologist at Georgetown Lombardi here in DC, and I have a question for Dr. Semenza and Dr. Kaelin. Can you expand upon how the discovery of HIF and VHL has influenced the way we treat patients with cancer?
Yeah.
Briefly.
So the patients with VHL mutations develop a variety of tumors, and as you well know, Michael, one of them is kidney cancer, which actually turns out to be one of the 10 most common cancers. We could show that HIF, and in particular a member of the HIF family called HIF2, is really one of the problems in those cancers. We had known for quite some time that HIF2 regulates a protein called VEGF, which allows the tumors to get a blood supply. And so we now have 7 approved VEGF inhibitors for the treatment of kidney cancer, and the HIF2 inhibitors look quite promising. And we think in time HIF inhibitors will be useful for other cancers as well.
Good. One more. Please, who are you?
I'm Jacob Paltgren. I'm a visiting researcher at University of Maryland. So I have a question for all of you, sort of about the next generation of researchers, kids. So you already expressed a concern that there might not be enough time for creativity. Like, do you have more concrete suggestions on what makes a good learning environment, what makes a good school? Maybe if you have examples from your own background and childhood.
Yeah. So I was born in 1957, which was the Sputnik year, and I've seen graphs of the number of households in America that had not only chemistry sets that I alluded to, but microscopes, engineering toys, et cetera. So I grew up, in this environment, as many of us in this room did, where science and engineering was celebrated, and science and engineers were the good guys. So I think that's part of it. And then I think having a curricula that, again, is not just rote memorization, but problem solving, including how to solve unsolvable problems.
Good.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that for kids to get early exposure to scientific research and see what's actually happening in research laboratories, because it's really exciting, and the sooner they're exposed to that, I think the more excited that kids will be about science. Unfortunately, when they're in school, it's kind of dry, just rote memorization. Nobody's going to be interested in that.
But to add to that, you mentioned playing in the backyard with your chemistry set.
Yes.
I had a chemistry set. It had things that are now forbidden.
Yes, absolutely. No, categorically.
And I was.
It's amazing I still have eyebrows still, actually.
These are hard to grasp. But I was also free to wander in the woods, catch tadpoles, wonder why they had those little legs behind. Unstructured play was influential to me.
That's great. Well, so first of all, let's thank the ambassador for hosting us. And then let's once again congratulate and thank our Nobelists for a wonderful event. Thank you.
Well done.
That's it. Thank you, everybody.